The lie felt like a stone in her pocket, smooth and heavy. Maya Solis traced the rim of her coffee mug, her gaze fixed on the Seattle rain painting gray streaks down her kitchen window. At 38, her life was a carefully constructed mosaic of responsibility, school runs, client meetings, and the quiet, steady love of a man named Alex. It was a good life. A stable life. But stability, she was discovering, could feel an awful lot like a cage. The phone on the table buzzed, lighting up with a name that sent a familiar, illicit thrill through her. Julian Thorne. He was a crack in the foundation of her perfectly ordered world. They'd connected in a comments section on a post about modern architecture, his profile a curated gallery of a life lived at altitude. Julian wasn't just wealthy. He was a visionary, a venture capitalist who spoke about disrupting industries and building empires from the ground up. His world was one of sun-drenched terraces in Monaco, ski trips to Gstaad, and art auctions in Basel. A world so far removed from school, PTA meetings and spreadsheet deadlines it felt like fiction. His first message had been a simple compliment on her, observation about a building's facade. Then came the flurry of texts, each one chipping away at her defenses. He didn't just listen. He saw her. He told her the fire in her was meant for more than burning out in boardrooms and bedtime stories. He made her feel like the woman she'd been before life had sanded down her edges. And now his offer. A weekend. A private flight to a luxury resort in Cabo San Lucas. A taste of the life you were meant for, Maya, he'd written. No strings, just an experience. The rational part of her, the part that had built her small graphic design business from nothing, screamed in protest. But the other part, the part that felt the slow, creeping dread of a life half-lived, whispered a single, seductive word. Why not? Her daughter Chloe was at a sleepover. Alex was at his apartment, likely planning the hiking trip they were supposed to take this weekend. He'd called an hour ago, his voice warm and trusting. I'll miss you, May. This client retreat came out of nowhere, huh? But knock 'em dead. Can't wait to hear all about it Monday. The stone in her pocket turned to lead. Yeah, me too. It's a big opportunity. She'd packed her suitcase after that call, her hands trembling as she folded a sundress she'd bought just for this trip. It was a betrayal, not of flesh but of spirit. She was betraying his trust, the future they were building. For what? For the promise of champagne and a view from the clouds? She zipped the bag closed. The sound was definitive, like a seal on a tomb. The drive to the private airfield north of the city was a blur of rain and doubt. Each mile felt like a step further from the person she was supposed to be. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, trying to quiet the screaming in her head. It's just a weekend, a harmless adventure. You deserve this. But as she pulled into the secluded airfield, the doubts were momentarily silenced by the sheer breathtaking spectacle of the jet. It wasn't just a plane. It was a sculpture of pure ambition, sleek, white, and impossibly long. It sat on the tarmac like a predator, its engines a low, impatient purr. The rain had stopped, and the setting sun broke through the clouds, setting the aircraft's silver accents on fire. And there he was, Julian Thorne. He leaned against the fuselage as if it were a common car, a picture of effortless power. He was younger than Alex, with sharp, handsome features and an easy confidence that seemed to bend the space around him. He wore a simple, impeccably tailored navy sweater and dark trousers. No flashy logos, just the quiet, deafening roar of extreme wealth. His smile when he saw her was a laser beam of attention. Maya, you're even more stunning in person. The words washed over her, warm and validating. The last of her resistance crumbled. This was real. He was real. It's incredible, Julian, she said, her voice barely a whisper. This? He gestured dismissively at the multi-million-dollar machine. Just a tool. The real magic is the destination. Come on, your chariot awaits. He took her bag, his hand brushing hers. A spark, intentional or not, shot up her arm. The interior of the jet was a cocoon of muted luxury. Creamy Italian leather seats that felt like warm skin. Polished ebony wood tables. Carpet so thick it swallowed sound. It was an environment designed to seduce the senses. And it was working. Julian settled into the seat opposite her as a uniformed attendant. Silent. Efficient. Poured Dom Perignon into crystal flutes. To new horizons, Julian said. Raising his glass, Maya clinked hers against it. The champagne bubbles burst on her tongue, dry and expensive. To new horizons. As the jet began to taxi, she looked out the window. Seattle, her life, her choices, all began to shrink, becoming a miniature diorama of a world she was leaving behind. The familiar vertigo of takeoff gripped her, a physical manifestation of the leap she was taking. Once they leveled off, soaring above a blanket of clouds stained orange and purple by the dying sun, a strange peace settled over her. The hum of the engines was a lullaby. The champagne was a balm. Julian's charm was a fortress against her guilt. He told her about the resort in Cabo, the private villa with its infinity pool, the chef he'd hired just for them. He spoke of his plans, his vision, and how he saw a similar spark of genius in her. He made her feel not like a guest, but like a partner in his grand adventure. For a glorious hour, she let herself believe it. She was Maya Solis, the woman who took risks, who embraced the extraordinary. Then the atmosphere began to curdle. It started with the other passengers. She'd been vaguely aware of 2 other men when she boarded, but they'd been quiet, almost spectral figures. Now, a door at the rear of the cabin opened, and a 3rd man emerged. He was large, with a thick neck and a predatory stillness. The 3 of them congregated in the back, their voices a low, guttural rumble that began to rise in pitch and volume. The polished conversation was gone, replaced by coarse laughter that felt like sandpaper on the luxurious ambiance. They were drinking whiskey, not champagne, straight from the bottle. The scent of expensive cologne was now undercut by the acrid tang of sweat and aggression. Maya tried to ignore them, focusing on Julian. But she saw a subtle shift in him. The focused, charming host was receding, replaced by something looser, more primal. He was feeding off their energy, feeling a need to anchor herself in her old life. To prove this was all just a fun diversion, she pulled out her phone. She angled it, capturing a selfie with the stunning cloudscape behind her. She wasn't going to post it, not with the lie she'd told Alex, but she wanted the photo for herself. A trophy from the edge of her life. The click of the shutter was like a gunshot in the cabin. The laughter died instantly. The largest of the men, the one with the thick neck, turned. His eyes, small and dark, locked onto her. "No pictures," he growled. The words were flat, absolute. Maya flinched, her phone feeling suddenly like a stolen object. I'm sorry. I was just... Privacy only," the man interrupted, his gaze unwavering. She looked to Julian, expecting his charming deflection, his smooth ability to calm the waters. His face was different. The warmth had evaporated, leaving behind a cool, polished mask. "He's right, Maya. The rules on this flight are different. No digital footprints." He offered a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's for everyone's protection." Protection from what? The question screamed in her mind, but she didn't voice it. The stone of her lie was back, heavier than ever, now cold with a new kind of fear. This wasn't just luxury. It was control. The gilded cage, she realized with a sickening lurch, was still a cage, and she had just willingly locked herself inside. The man in the back kept staring, a faint, unpleasant smile playing on his lips. The jet hurtled on through the darkening sky, and for the first time, Maya Solis understood the true meaning of the word trap. The champagne turned to acid in Maya's stomach. The plush leather seat, once a throne, now felt like the electric chair. The low, respectful hum of the jet's engines had morphed into the menacing growl of a beast carrying her to her doom. Julian tried to resurrect his charm, topping off her glass with a practiced smile. "Don't mind Leo," he said, nodding toward the hulking man who had challenged her. "He's just protective of our privacy. You understand, in our world, discretion is everything." His words were smooth, but they rang hollow. The mask had slipped, and she had seen the cold calculation beneath. The other 2 men, a wiry, twitchy individual named Marco and a cold-eyed man introduced only as Stefan, watched the exchange with predatory interest. Their earlier boisterousness had been replaced by a focused, unnerving silence. "Of course," Maya managed, her voice tight. She placed her phone on the table, screen down, a gesture of surrender. The flight wore on. The night outside the window an abyss. The men in the back resumed their drinking, but the mood had irrevocably shifted. A small polished silver case was produced. Maya watched, her blood running cold, as Marco laid out lines of a white crystalline powder on the glass tabletop. The casual, ritualistic snorting, the sharp, satisfied inhalations, It was a display of brazenness that stripped away the last veneer of sophistication. These weren't just wealthy party boys. They were wolves. Julian partook, then offered the straw to Maya. A little something to take the edge off. Help you enjoy the ride. Her stomach churned. No, thank you. His smile tightened. Suit yourself. He leaned back, his eyes glazing over slightly, the pupils dilating. The change in him was immediate and terrifying. The suave venture capitalist was gone, replaced by someone entitled, volatile, and dangerous. You know, Maya, he slurred, leaning into her space, his breath a mix of champagne and something chemical. You're a very beautiful woman, but you're also tense. You're still holding on to that little life back in Seattle. You need to let go. His hand landed on her knee, heavy and possessive. She froze, every muscle locking in primal fear. Julian, please don't, she whispered, her voice trembling. He ignored her, his hand sliding up her thigh. I've invested a lot in this weekend. I expect a return. Across the cabin, Leo chuckled, a low, ugly sound. Looks like the princess isn't used to real fun, Jules. Panic, sharp and absolute, seized her. She tried to stand, to push his hand away, but Julian's grip tightened, his fingers digging into her flesh. Let me go, she cried out, her voice rising in pitch. The sound of her fear seemed to excite them. Marco and Stefan were on their feet now, moving to flank her. The cabin, once so spacious, became a claustrophobic prison. Now, none of that, Julian cooed, his voice a venomous parody of comfort. We're just getting started. He nodded to Leo. The large man moved with startling speed, grabbing her arms and pinning her back into the seat. The scent of his sweat and cheap cologne filled her nostrils, making her gag. No. Stop, please, she screamed, thrashing against his iron grip. Her cries were swallowed by the jet's engine roar. There was no one to hear her. No flight attendant would come to her aid. She was utterly, completely alone. Julian stood over her, his face a mask of detached cruelty. The man who had spoken of sunsets and empires was gone. You wanted a new life, Maya. Well, this is it. What followed was a blur of tearing fabric, bruising hands, and suffocating weight. Her screams were met with laughter or harsh shushes. She was passed between them, a toy for their amusement, her world dissolving into a nightmare of pain and degradation. She fought, she scratched, she bit, but she was a sparrow in a hurricane. At some point, the assault became too much for her body to bear. Her vision tunneled, the leering faces above her blurring into monstrous shapes. The sounds became muffled, as if she were sinking underwater. A profound, terrifying silence began to encroach from the edges of her consciousness. The last thing she saw was Julian's face. Devoid of any emotion, watching her with the clinical interest of a scientist observing a failed experiment. Then, nothing. Leo was the first to notice. Jules, she's not moving. The frantic energy in the cabin snapped. The laughter died. Julian leaned down, placing 2 fingers on her neck. He held them there for a long moment, his expression unreadable. She's not breathing, he said. His voice flat and calm, a different kind of panic. Cold and self-preserving, took hold. What the hell did you do? Marco hissed, his twitching worse than ever. We, Julian corrected, his voice cutting through the panic like a scalpel. We did this. And now we have a problem. He stood up, straightening his sweater, a CEO assessing a logistical error. We're 40 minutes from landing. We can't have her found like this. The reality of the situation crashed down on them. They were no longer just rich boys behaving badly. They were murderers. We dump her, Stefan said, his voice the coldest of them all. Once we're low enough over the ocean, we open the door. Julian shook his head. Too messy. The flight path is logged. If she washes up, it leads right back to this jet. We need to make her unidentifiable. Or better yet, make her disappear entirely. His gaze fell upon Maya's lifeless form, and a horrifying plan solidified in his eyes. We'll land as scheduled. We have people at the Strip. We'll take her to the desert. They'll never find enough of her to know who she was. He looked at Leo. Make sure they can't ID her. Fast. Leo nodded, a grim professional taking orders. He pulled a switchblade from his pocket. The click of the blade locking into place was the final definitive sound of Maya Solis's world. The act was swift, brutal, and devoid of humanity. It was not an act of passion, but of corporate cleanup. A liability was being managed. As the jet began its descent into the private airfield outside Cabo San Lucas, the men worked with a frantic, efficient haste. They cleaned the cabin, wiping away fingerprints and any trace of Maya's presence. Her purse, her phone, her suitcase, all were placed into a separate bag to be incinerated. The jet touched down with a gentle bump, rolling to a stop in a remote hangar far from the main terminal lights. The door opened not to the warm, salty air of a Mexican resort, but to the dusty, dry heat of the desert night and the waiting, grim faces of Julian's local contacts. Maya's body, wrapped in a tarp, was carried out into the darkness. The gilded cage had opened, but only to cast its broken contents into the void. The last chapter of Maya Solis's dream getaway was written not in the sands of a beautiful beach, but in the arid, unforgiving soil of a shallow, unmarked grave. The private jet, the symbol of her ultimate escape, had become her coffin. The California sun was too bright. It felt like an insult to Alex Reyes as he paced the length of his living room, the phone pressed to his ear for the 10th time that morning. "I'm sorry, the number you have dialed is currently unavailable." It was Monday. Maya had promised she'd be back Sunday night. She'd never missed a check-in with Chloe, never. Not once. A cold knot, which had been forming in his gut since Sunday evening, was now a solid block of ice. He'd called the number she'd given him for the client retreat, a disconnected line. He'd called her design partners. They knew of no retreat. The lie, which he had so willingly accepted, now felt like a shard of glass in his heart. His phone buzzed, and his heart leaped. It wasn't Maya. It was her sister, Isabella. "Alex, have you heard from her? She was supposed to call Chloe last night. This isn't like her." The ice in his gut spread to his veins. I don't know where she is, Izzy." The confession hung in the air, terrifying and final. He told her about the retreat, the disconnected number. He heard the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Alex," Isabella said, her voice trembling. "Check her Instagram." With fumbling fingers, he pulled up the app. And there it was. A single post from Saturday afternoon, a selfie of Maya, her face flushed with excitement, her smile radiant, but, to Alex's now terrified eyes, strained. Behind her, the opulent interior of a private jet. The caption, "New Horizons. Life's an adventure, right? Your private jet, Cheer Cabo bound, Cabo, not a corporate retreat in Portland. A private jet." The pieces, jagged and horrifying, began to click into place. The distant behavior, the secretive phone calls, the new expensive lingerie he'd found in her laundry. It hadn't been for him. A wave of nausea washed over him, followed by a surge of white-hot anger. She'd lied. She'd been having an affair. But the anger was instantly consumed by a far more powerful emotion, dread, because the woman in that photo, the woman he loved, was in over her head. He could feel it. He called the police. The discovery was made by a ranch hand, Manuel Ortiz, just after dawn. He was checking fence lines on the vast, scrub-covered property bordering the private airfield when a flash of color caught his eye. Not a natural color. Teal. The color of the sundress Maya had packed with such trembling hope. The scene was a violation of the quiet desert. The body was discarded, almost casually, as if taking out the trash. The injuries were unspeakable. The local police, out of their depth, immediately called in the state investigators. Detective Eva Rostova stood over the remains, her face a granite mask. She'd seen the worst of humanity, but the specific, calculated cruelty of this act, the disfigurement meant to delay identification, stoked a cold fire in her chest. This was personal. Her partner, Detective Ben Miller, muttered, snapping on a latex glove. And this was professionals. They didn't want her found, or at least not identified quickly. Back at the station, the ID came through fast. A missing person report filed by a frantic Alex Reyes matched the description. The dental records confirmed it. Maya Solis. When Rostova made the call to Alex, the sound that came through the receiver was not a sob, but a raw, guttural cry of agony, as if his soul were being torn in two. She had to wait a full minute before she could speak again. "Mr. Reyes, we need to know everything. Who was she with?" And so, through shattered breaths, Alex told her about Julian Thorne, the online persona, the venture capitalist, the private jet to Cabo. The investigation ignited. They pulled the flight manifests for the private airfield. A jet owned by a shell corporation linked to Julian Thorne had filed a flight plan from Seattle to Cabo San Lucas on Saturday. It had landed, refueled, and returned to a different private strip in California on Sunday. It had never gone to Mexico. The security footage from the Seattle airfield was the final damning piece. There was Maya, vibrant and alive, walking up the air stairs, turning to wave at someone off camera with a brilliant, trusting smile. And there was Julian Thorne guiding her in, the perfect gentleman. There was no footage of her ever getting off. She never left that plane, Rostova said, her voice low and hard. They killed her in the air. The hunt for Julian Thorne began. But as they dug, the pristine facade of his life began to crack, revealing a rotted core. His venture capital firm was a spiderweb of offshore accounts and shell companies, a convoluted system designed to launder money for a powerful and ruthless cartel. The private jets, the luxury homes, they weren't the rewards of business. They were the tools of it. He wasn't a financier. He was a glorified bagman, a traitor to his class who used his privilege to traffic in drugs, weapons, and human misery. Maya hadn't been killed by a jealous lover. She had been a piece of collateral damage, a loose end tied off by a syndicate of monsters. The press got wind of it. The story of the private jet murder exploded. A beautiful, hard-working mother, lured to her death by a handsome, wealthy psychopath. It was a tabloid editor's dream and a family's living hell. Alex sat in Maya's apartment, surrounded by the ghost of her life, Chloe's drawings on the fridge, her favorite coffee mug, the scent of her perfume still lingering in the air. The grief was a physical weight crushing him. But beneath it, something else was hardening, a resolve as cold and sharp as steel. He looked at a photo of Maya and Chloe laughing on a beach. The woman in that photo had been extinguished for convenience. He turned to Rostova, his eyes red-rimmed but dry, his voice eerily calm. "Find them," he said. "Find them all. I don't care what it takes. I'm going to help you burn their whole world down." The operation to take down Julian Thorne was a silent, sprawling net, cast across 2 countries. Detective Rostova worked with federal agencies, following the digital money trail that Julian had been so careful to obscure. Alex, using his own background in tech, became an unexpected asset, cross-referencing Julian's social circles with corporate records, finding the tiny cracks in their armor. It was Alex who found the link to the hangar in California, the one owned by another of Julian's shell companies. It was Alex who, poring over flight logs, noticed a discrepancy in the fuel consumption on the return leg of the fatal flight. Consistent with a heavier load, a detour. They weren't just building a murder case. They were dismantling an empire. The break came from within. Marco, the twitchy accomplice, was picked up on an unrelated drug charge. Facing a decade in prison and haunted by the memory of Maya's lifeless eyes, he cracked. He offered everything, names, dates, transactions, and a full confession of what happened on the jet. He gave them Leo and Stefan. He gave them the cartel contacts in Mexico, and he gave them Julian Thorne. The raid happened at a glass-walled penthouse in San Diego. Julian was having breakfast on the terrace, overlooking the Pacific, the picture of a successful man. He didn't struggle as the tactical team swarmed in, as if he had always known this was how his story would end. His only words, spoken to Rostova as she clicked the cuffs on his wrists, were, "You have no idea what you're interfering with." The trials were a media circus. Julian, Leo, and Stefan were charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and a litany of federal crimes including money laundering and conspiracy to traffic narcotics. They sat at the defendant's table, flanked by high-priced lawyers, their expressions a mixture of arrogance and bored contempt. They were a brotherhood of privilege and psychopathy, convinced the system couldn't truly touch them. Alex was there every day. He was a fixture in the front row of the gallery, a silent, grim sentinel. He watched as the prosecutors laid out the evidence, the flight logs, the forensic analysis from the jet, the financial records, Marco's tearful testimony. He watched as Julian's defense team tried to paint Maya as a willing gold digger who'd succumbed to a drug overdose, a narrative so vile it made Alex's hands clench into fists. He never looked away. Not during the graphic testimony of the medical examiner, not when the photo of Maya's discarded body was displayed for the court. He absorbed the horror, letting it fuel his resolve. The most poignant moment came when Chloe, now 10 years old, asked to speak. The judge allowed it, a rare exception. Holding Alex's hand, her small voice echoing in the hushed courtroom, she said, "Your Honor, Julian Thorne took my mom. She was my best friend. She helped me with my homework and made me pancakes on Saturdays. Now my Saturdays are quiet. Please don't let him take anyone else's mom." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Even the stoic court reporter wiped a tear away. The defendant stared straight ahead, unmoved. The closing arguments were made. The fate of the three men was handed over to the jury. The wait was an agony. Alex paced the courthouse hallways, the polished floors reflecting the ghost of his own exhausted face. He thought of Maya's laugh. He thought of the last time he'd held her. He thought of the future they'd planned, now lying in ashes. After 3 days, the jury returned. The courtroom was so silent you could hear the rustle of the judge's robes as he took the bench. The foreman stood, a single piece of paper in his hand. Alex stopped breathing. "On the count of murder in the first degree of Maya Solis, we, the jury, find the defendant, Julian Thorne, guilty." The word hit the room like a thunderclap. A collective gasp, then a wave of muted sobs from Maya's family. Isabella reached for Alex's hand, her grip like a vice. "Guilty. Guilty. Guilty." The foreman read the verdict for each charge, for each man. Leo. Stefan. The litany of guilt was absolute. They had been found guilty on all counts. Julian Thorne's face, for the first time, showed a flicker of genuine emotion. Not remorse, but sheer incandescent rage at being held accountable. The invincible shield of his wealth and connections had shattered. As the judge sentenced them each to life in prison without the possibility of parole, Alex felt nothing. Not the triumphant surge of victory he had imagined, but a profound, hollow emptiness. The monster was caged, but Maya was still gone. The world had not been set right. It had simply been denied from spinning further into darkness. In the weeks that followed, the media frenzy died down. The world moved on. But for Alex and Chloe, the battle was just beginning. The battle to rebuild a life from the ruins. The most natural, and yet most monumental decision of Alex's life was to adopt Chloe. He sat with her on the couch Maya had picked out, the same one they'd all cuddled on during movie nights. "Chloe," he began, his voice thick, "I loved your mom more than anything. And I love you just as much. I know I can't replace her, but I want to be your dad, officially, if you'll have me." Chloe, a child who had aged years in a matter of months, looked at him with Maya's eyes. She simply nodded and burrowed into his side. "I'd like that," she whispered. The legal process was a formality. On the day the adoption was finalized, they went to the beach, the one from the photo. They held hands, watching the waves crash against the shore, a relentless, healing rhythm. It wasn't about vengeance in the end, Alex said later, in a quiet interview for a documentary on the case. It was about love. It was about making sure a part of Maya, the very best part, had a chance to grow up safe and loved. It was about giving Chloe a horizon to look toward. The camera lingered on them, walking away, hand in hand, two silhouettes against the setting sun. Their steps were slow, but they were moving forward. The grief was a permanent resident in their hearts, a room they would always carry with them. But they were learning to live in the other rooms, too, the rooms filled with memory, with resilience, and with a love that not even death could fully extinguish. The story of Maya Solis was a tragedy, a warning whispered on the wind about the predators who hide in plain sight, behind the glittering screens of social media and the promise of a gilded life. But the story of Alex and Chloe was one of a different kind. A story of how, even in the deepest night, the human spirit can find a way to mend, to love, and to begin again.